In the autumn of 732, a bastard son named Charles stood on a wooded ridge between Tours and Poitiers and made a decision that should have ended in slaughter. Behind him lay the last Christian kingdom in Western Europe. Before him, an army that had conquered more territory in 100 years than Rome had in 400. From Arabia to the Atlantic, from the Indus to the Pyrenees, the Umayyad Caliphate had swallowed civilizations whole. Persia, gone. Byzantine Africa, gone. Visigothic Spain, erased in 3 years. Now Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, the finest general the Caliphate had ever sent west, was burning his way toward the holiest shrine in Christendom. His cavalry had already shattered every army that dared face them. Duke Odo of Aquitaine had fled north with the survivors, begging help from a man he'd spent years trying to destroy. Charles had no cavalry to match the Muslims, no stirrups, no experience against enemies like these. What he had was 15,000 men willing to stand like a wall of ice and never move. What happened next would determine whether Europe remained Christian at all. In the year 632, the Prophet Muhammad drew his final breath, and the world had no idea what was coming. 100 years later, the Umayyad Caliphate controlled over 11 million square kilometers of territory, and 29% of the entire human population lived under Islamic rule. Historians would later write that in speed and extent these Arab conquests were matched only by those of Alexander the Great, and they were more lasting. Think about what that means. The Sassanid Persian Empire, one of the 2 great powers of the ancient world, a civilization that had stood for 400 years and challenged Rome itself, was completely destroyed, not conquered, not subjugated, erased from existence. Byzantine Africa fell, Egypt fell, Syria fell, and then in 711, a Berber general named Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed the narrow strait that would bear his name with roughly 7,000 men and met the Visigothic king Roderick at the Battle of Guadalete. The king died on that field along with most of his nobility, and within 3 years, nearly all of the Iberian Peninsula was under Muslim control. A kingdom that had stood since the fall of Rome vanished in less time than it takes to raise a child. By 719, Muslim armies had crossed the Pyrenees into what is now France and captured the city of Narbonne. This was not an army. This was a force of nature. This was a tide that had never been stopped. The man chosen to command this tide in 732 was Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, and he was not chosen by accident. He came from the Yemenite Arab tribe of Ghafiq, a lineage of pure descent that mattered enormously in an empire riven by ethnic hatreds between Arabs and Berbers. He had survived what others had not. In 721 he served as second in command at the Battle of Toulouse, the first catastrophic Muslim defeat on French soil, where the governor Al-Sam was killed, and Abdul Rahman led the shattered survivors south to safety. For the next decade he watched 9 governors fail to hold Al-Andalus together, each one torn apart by the factional rivalries that plagued the province. Arab against Berber, Syrian against Jemeni, ambition against ambition. In 730, Caliph Hisham finally appointed Abdul Rahman as wali, governor and commander, and gave him something no predecessor had received, a fatwa granting absolute authority. The historians who wrote of him were unanimous. He was the best governor Al-Andalus ever knew. Intelligent, eloquent, an accomplished administrator, he alone could unify what no one else could hold together. In 731 he proved his worth by crushing the rebellion of Munusa, the Berber deputy who had allied with Duke Odo of Aquitaine, and he captured Odo's own daughter and sent her to a harem in Damascus as a message. This was not a reckless raider drunk on plunder. This was the most capable administrator general the Caliphate had ever sent west. And now he was coming for the richest shrine in Christendom. The man who would stand against him began life with nothing but disadvantages. Charles was born sometime between 686 and 688 at Herstal, in what is now Belgium, the illegitimate son of Pepin II and his concubine Alpaida. A colourful legend claims that when the messenger arrived to announce the birth, he was so terrified of Pepin's legitimate wife Plectrude that he spoke in code, saying only that it was a carl, meaning a man in Old Germanic, and Pepin, equally cautious, replied, "Then let him be called that." Whether the story is true or not, Charles grew up knowing he would inherit nothing. When Pepin died on December 16, 714, everything changed for the worse. Plectrude had convinced the dying ruler to name his 8-year-old grandson Theudald as heir, cutting Charles out entirely, and she immediately had the 26-year-old warrior imprisoned in Cologne. She recognized what everyone recognized. Charles was dangerous. He would become a rallying point for every noble unhappy with a child on the throne. The sources are frustratingly silent on how he escaped. They simply note that before the end of 745, he broke free and fled to his mother's kin along the lower Meuse River. In 716, he met the combined Neustrian and Frisian armies near Cologne and suffered the only defeat of his entire military career. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, he retreated to the hills of the Eifel to gather and train new men. Then came his signature move. At the Battle of Ambelave, he attacked the enemy at midday while they rested, splitting his forces to strike from multiple directions so that his army appeared far larger than it was. His reputation exploded. Warriors flocked to his banner. By 724, after victories at Vincy and Soissons, he had crushed all opposition and become undisputed master of Francia. The chroniclers describe him as a tall, powerfully built man who was more agile than his size would lead men to believe. At the time of Tours, he was approximately 44 to 46 years old. A battle-hardened veteran at the peak of his powers who had clawed his way from a prison cell to supreme command through sheer will and battlefield genius. Now he faced the greatest test any Christian commander had ever known, and the fate of everything hung on whether he could stop what no one else had stopped. In the spring of 732, Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi led his army across the Pyrenees and into the lands of the Franks, with a force that contemporary sources estimate between 20,000 and 80,000 warriors, depending on who was counting. His objectives were clear and calculated. First, he would punish Duke Odo of Aquitaine for sheltering the rebel Munusa and for daring to make alliance with enemies of the Caliphate. Second, he would seize the legendary wealth of St. Martin's Basilica at Tours, the holiest shrine in Western Christendom, a treasury so vast that pilgrims came from across Europe to marvel at its golden relics. The army swept through Aquitaine like a desolating storm, burning villages, taking slaves, stripping churches of everything valuable. Duke Odo gathered his forces and met the invaders near Bordeaux, believing his Aquitanian warriors could stand against the men who had conquered half the known world. He was catastrophically wrong. The Muslim cavalry employed their devastating Kawafar tactics, waves of horsemen charging in, loosing arrows, wheeling away before the infantry could respond, then charging again from a different angle. Odo's men had never faced anything like it. They had trained to fight other Franks, other Christians, men who stood in lines and traded blows until one side broke. Against cavalry that refused to engage on their terms, they were helpless. The Aquitanian army shattered on the first real charge. The Mozarabic Chronicle recorded the aftermath with a single haunting line. God alone knows the number of the slain. Odo fled north with whatever survivors he could gather, leaving behind a duchy in flames. The plunder taken by Abdul Rahman's army was enormous. Wagons groaned under the weight of gold and silver, stripped from churches. Slaves stumbled in chains behind the cavalry. Holy relics that Christians had venerated for centuries became trophies for soldiers who saw them as proof of Allah's favour. Everything Odo had built over decades of careful rule was destroyed in weeks, and now nothing stood between Abdul Rahman and Paris except one man. The same man Odo had spent years trying to destroy. The hatred between Duke Odo of Aquitaine and Charles ran deep and bitter. For years, they had circled each other like wolves fighting over territory. Odo wanted independence for his duchy, freedom from Frankish interference, the right to rule his lands without bowing to any northern warlord. Charles wanted what Charles always wanted: everything. He had already absorbed most of the Frankish kingdoms through war and intimidation, and Aquitaine was next on his list. They had nearly gone to war multiple times. They had sabotaged each other's alliances. They had watched each other with the cold patience of men waiting for the right moment to strike. Now, Odo stood before his hated rival as a broken man. His army was destroyed. His duchy was burning. His people were being sold into slavery, and he had come to beg for help from the one person on earth he least wanted to owe anything to. Picture that meeting. Odo, proud Duke of Aquitaine, descendant of kings, forced to kneel before an illegitimate son of a concubine. Charles, who had clawed his way from a prison cell to supreme power, finally seeing his rival humbled completely. The calculation Charles made was brutally simple. If Aquitaine fell, then Francia was next. The same cavalry that had shattered Odo's army would shatter his. The same tactics that had taken Bordeaux would take Paris. He had no choice but to help. But help would come at a price. Odo must recognize Charles as his overlord. Aquitanian independence, the cause Odo had fought for his entire life, must end. Odo agreed because he had nothing left to bargain with. His duchy was gone. His army was gone. His pride was the only thing remaining, and pride does not stop cavalry charges. Charles immediately sent out the summons. Every warrior who owed him service, every man who could hold a spear, every veteran who had campaigned with him through 15 years of constant warfare. Two men who hated each other with every fibre of their being would now have to trust each other completely, or they would die separately. Charles gathered between 15,000 and 30,000 men for the march south, and these were not soft levies pulled from farms and villages. These were hardened professional soldiers who had fought beside him since the dark days after his escape from Cologne. They had stood with him at Ambelev. They had broken the Neustrians at Vincy. They had crushed every enemy Charles had pointed them at for a decade and a half. But they were infantry. They carried heavy shields and long spears and axes that could split a man's skull through a helmet. They wore thick cloaks of wolf and bear fur against the October cold that was already settling over the land. What they did not have was cavalry to match the Muslims. They had no stirrups, no tradition of fighting from horseback, no way to counter the hit-and-run tactics that had annihilated the Aquitanians. Charles knew this. He knew that if he met Abdul Rahman in open ground, his men would die, just as Odos had died. So he formed a different plan. He would choose ground that negated the Muslim cavalry advantage. He would find a position where trees would break their charges, and hills would limit their mobility. He would force them to come to him on his terms, or not at all. The last army of Christian Western Europe marched south through the autumn chill, toward a destiny that would be written in blood. Charles arrived first and chose his ground with the eye of a man who had won every battle he ever fought, except one. He positioned his forces on a wooded ridge, somewhere between Tours and Poitiers, likely near the place that would later be called Musée-la-Bataille, which simply means battlefield. The trees were thick enough to break any cavalry charge before it could build momentum. The slopes were steep enough to exhaust horses trying to climb them. From this position his infantry could stand in their dense formations and let the terrain do half the work of killing. Abdul Rahman arrived and saw immediately what Charles had done. The Frankish position was nearly perfect for defence and nearly impossible to assault with cavalry. For 7 days neither army moved. The Mozarabic chronicle records that each side tormented the other with raids for almost 7 days before finally preparing their battle lines to fight. 7 days of skirmishing and probing attacks. 7 days of watching and waiting. 7 days of two master generals studying each other across that wooded ground, each one knowing that the man who attacked first would be at a disadvantage. Abdul Rahman faced an impossible choice. Winter was coming, and his army was not prepared for it. His men wore the light armour suited to the blazing heat of Spain and North Africa. The Franks in their thick furs were comfortable in the cold that was already making his soldiers shiver at night. Every day he waited his army grew weaker, hungrier, more restless. The plunder wagons that had seemed like such a blessing were now a burden, slowing movement, tempting men to think about what they had rather than what they might win. He could retreat, but retreat meant admitting defeat, meant returning to Al-Andalus, having failed where others had failed before him, meant watching his carefully built authority crumble as rivals smelled weakness. Or he could attack. Charles waited with the patience of a man who understood exactly what was happening. Let them freeze. Let them starve. Let them grow desperate. Sooner or later, Abdul Rahman would have to come to him, and when he did, the wall would be waiting. On the 7th day, Abdul Rahman made his decision because he had no other choice left to make. His army was freezing. His supplies were dwindling. His men were growing restless, eyeing the plunder wagons and wondering why they should risk their lives for more gold when they already had enough to make them rich. Every day the October cold bit deeper, and every night more soldiers huddled around fires that could not warm them. He could see his army dying slowly without a single Frankish spear being thrust. So at dawn he ordered the attack, and the greatest cavalry force Western Europe had ever seen began to form up on the plains below the Frankish position. Picture them assembling in the grey morning light, rank after rank of horsemen in gleaming chainmail, curved swords hanging at their sides, compound bows that could punch arrows through armor at 200 yards, and beneath them horses bred for war in the deserts of Arabia and the mountains of North Africa. These were the men who had conquered Persia. These were the sons and grandsons of warriors who had broken the Byzantine Empire. They had stirrups, which the Franks did not, allowing them to fight from horseback with a stability that made their cavalry charges devastating. Behind them came the infantry, lighter armed, ready to exploit whatever gaps the cavalry tore open. Up on the ridge the Franks watched them come and did not move. Charles had positioned his men in a dense phalanx, shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping to form an unbroken wall of wood and iron. Long spears bristled forward like the quills of some enormous beast. Behind the first rank stood more men with axes and swords, ready to step forward when their brothers fell. Charles himself stood in the centre, surrounded by his veteran liegemen, the warriors who had followed him from the prison in Cologne through every battle that had made him master of Francia. The Mozarabic chronicle would later record that the men of the north seemed like a sea that cannot be moved. Firmly they stood, one close to another, forming as it were a bulwark of ice. For a long moment silence hung over that field. Two civilizations faced each other across a few hundred yards of wooded slope. Two faiths, two futures. Then the horns sounded, and the cavalry charged. The first wave of Muslim horsemen surged up the hill and into the trees, and immediately the terrain began to do what Charles had known it would do. Horses that could build devastating momentum on flat ground found themselves struggling uphill through undergrowth and between tree trunks. The tight formations that made cavalry charges so lethal began to spread and fragment as riders picked their way through obstacles. And then they hit the wall. The sound was like nothing any man there had ever heard. Horses screaming as they impaled themselves on the Frankish spears, riders thrown forward into the mass of shields, where axes split their skulls before they could rise. The momentum that should have shattered an infantry line simply stopped, absorbed by 15,000 men who had planted their feet and refused to move. The Franks did not break, they did not waver, they did not take a single step backward. The Mozarabic chronicle captured it perfectly. The northern peoples remained as immobile as a wall, holding together like a glacier in the cold regions. In the blink of an eye they annihilated the Arabs with the sword. The first charge failed, and Abdul Rahman sent another, and another. Wave after wave of cavalry crashed against that ridge, and wave after wave fell back, leaving dead men and dead horses piling up before the Frankish line. The Kar-Wafar tactics that had destroyed Duke Odo's army at Bordeaux were useless here. Those tactics required space to maneuver, room to wheel and charge again from a different angle. The trees took that away. The slopes took that away. The Franks, with their interlocking shields and their 15 years of fighting together, took that away. Muslim archers sent volleys arcing over the battlefield, and the Franks simply raised their shields and let the arrows thud into wood and leather while they held their formation. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher. Men died on both sides in numbers that no chronicler could count. At one point the Muslim cavalry broke through a section of the Frankish line, and Charles himself was surrounded, fighting hand to hand with enemies who had penetrated to the heart of his army. His liegemen closed around him with the desperate fury of men who knew that if their commander fell, everything was lost. They threw the attackers back. They sealed the breach. They held. This is what the Persians must have felt at Marathon when the Athenian phalanx would not break. This is what every army that has ever faced disciplined infantry has felt when they realize that courage alone cannot shatter men who have decided they will die before they move. The line held. While the battle raged, Duke Odo did something that would change everything, and he did it not for glory, but for vengeance. With his surviving Aquitanian cavalry, the remnants of the army that had been shattered at Bordeaux, he circled wide around the battlefield and found the Muslim camp. It was barely guarded. Why would it be? Every capable fighting man was on that ridge trying to break the Frankish wall, and the camp was loaded with plunder, all the gold stripped from the churches of Aquitaine, all the silver taken from monasteries and noble houses, all the slaves chained together, waiting to be marched south to the markets of Al-Andalus. Odo attacked, and the camp began to burn. Tents went up in flames. Slaves ran in every direction as their guards fled or died. The gold that men had fought and killed for scattered across the trampled ground. Word of the raid spread through the Umayyad army like fire through dry grass. The camp is under attack. The plunder is being taken. Everything we won is being lost. And soldiers began to peel away from the battle. First a few, then more, then entire units turning their horses and riding back toward the camp to protect what they had already taken. The movement looked like a retreat, and in battle, when men see what looks like a retreat, panic spreads faster than any plague. Many of these soldiers had not come for faith or for the glory of the Caliphate. They had come for plunder, for the wealth that would let them buy land and slaves and live like lords when they returned home. When that plunder was threatened, their loyalty fractured in an instant. The tide of the battle turned, and it turned not on heroism or divine intervention, but on simple human greed. Abdul Rahman saw his army fragmenting, and he did what great commanders have always done in the face of disaster. He rode into the chaos himself to rally his men. The Arab chroniclers recorded that while Abdurrahman strove to check their tumult and to lead them back to battle, he pushed his horse through the fleeing soldiers, shouting orders, trying to restore discipline through the sheer force of his will and his reputation. For a moment it seemed to work. Men who had begun to flee stopped when they saw their general. Units that had broken began to reform around his banner. If any man could have held that army together, it was Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, the finest governor Al-Andalus had ever known, the one leader who commanded respect from Arab and Berber alike. But the Franks saw what was happening. They saw the enemy general exposed in the chaos of his own fragmenting army. They pushed forward. The warriors of the Franks came around him, the chronicle records, and he was pierced through with many spears so that he died. The Mosarebic chronicle adds simply that they killed the king, striking him on the chest. Abdul Rahman fell from his horse, and his banner fell with him, and in that moment the army that had conquered more territory than Rome broke completely. There was no one to replace him, no one else who commanded the loyalty of all the factions. The Arab generals blamed the Berbers blamed the Syrians blamed everyone. The army that had seemed invincible that morning dissolved into a mob of men thinking only of survival. A great general died that day, doing what great generals do. He died trying to save his men. Honor him for that, even as the spears found his heart. Charles did not pursue, and that decision saved his army. He knew the feigned retreat was one of the oldest tricks in cavalry warfare. Pretend to flee, draw the infantry out of formation, then wheel and destroy them in the open. He had not won by abandoning the tactics that had kept his men alive. Night fell, and the Franks held their position on that blood-soaked ridge, shields still raised, spears still forward, watching the darkness for any sign of renewed attack. None came. Down in what remained of the Muslim camp, the surviving generals argued through the night, but they could not agree on anything. Without Abdul Rahman, there was no clear chain of command. Old ethnic hatreds that he had suppressed through sheer competence erupted immediately. Arab accused Berber. Berber accused Syrian. Everyone blamed everyone else for the disaster. Sometime in the darkest hours before dawn, they made the only decision they could agree on. They would retreat. They gathered what remained of their plunder, formed up in tight columns, and marched south as quietly as thousands of men and horses can march. When dawn broke over the battlefield, the Franks saw something eerie. The Muslim camp was still there. The tents still stood in their rows, just as they had the day before. The banners still flew. From a distance it looked like an army waiting for battle. Charles sent scouts forward, half expecting an ambush. They found nothing. The tents were empty. The fires were cold. The army of the Caliphate had vanished in the night, fled silently in tight formation, returning to their own country. The Franks walked through that ghost camp in the pale morning light, past abandoned tents and scattered equipment and the cold ashes of fires that would never be relit. The storm had passed, the glacier had held, and somewhere on the road south, the greatest army Islam had ever sent against Western Europe was running for home. The victory at Tours did not end the war. That is the truth that romanticized histories often forget. In 735, just 3 years after Abdul Rahman's death on that bloody ridge, a new Muslim army crossed the Pyrenees, seeking to avenge the defeat and continue what their predecessors had started. They captured Arles. They took Avignon. They raided as far north as Lyon and into Burgundy, burning and plundering as they went. Charles fought two more major campaigns in 736 and 739 to drive them back, grinding through years of brutal warfare that history remembers far less than the single dramatic day near Poitiers. The Muslims held Narbonne until 759, 18 years after Charles himself was dead and buried. So what did Tours actually accomplish if the fighting continued for decades afterward? It broke the momentum. It shattered the aura of invincibility that had surrounded Islamic armies for 100 years. Before Tours, every Christian force that had faced the Caliphate's cavalry in open battle had been destroyed. The Visigoths at Guadalete, the Aquitanians at Bordeaux. Army after army swept away like sand before a flood. After Tours, the flood had met something it could not wash away. The psychological impact was enormous, even if the strategic situation remained contested. And then in 740 something happened that had nothing to do with Charles or the Franks at all. The Berber tribes of North Africa, who had provided much of the military manpower for the conquest of Spain and the raids into France, revolted against Arab rule. The Great Berber Revolt lasted 3 years and killed approximately 18,000 Umayyad soldiers. The 30,000 elite Syrian troops sent to crush it mostly never returned. A planned major invasion of Gaul halted at Zaragoza when news of the uprising arrived, and that army never marched north. By 744, the Caliph himself had been assassinated, and civil war consumed what remained of Umayyad power. By 750, the dynasty that had built the largest empire the world had ever seen was overthrown by the Abbasids, and the surviving Umayyads fled to Spain, where they would rule a diminished kingdom for centuries, but never again threaten the heart of Europe. Tours did not cause all of this, but consider the counterfactual. Had Charles fallen at Tours the way Roderick had fallen at Guadalete, had the Frankish army broken the way every other Christian army had broken, what then? There was no second line of defense. There was no other organized military power in Western Europe capable of resisting. Paris would have fallen. The rich monasteries of Francia would have been plundered. The momentum that Tours interrupted would have continued unchecked. There would have been no Carolingian dynasty, no Charlemagne, no Holy Roman Empire, no medieval Christendom as we know it. Tours may not have been the only wall, but it was the first wall that did not break. Something else happened at Tours that historians did not fully appreciate until centuries later. The Mozarabic Chronicle of 754, written just 22 years after the battle by a Christian living under Muslim rule in Spain, describes the victors using a word that had never appeared in any Latin text before: Europenses. Europeans. Before Tours, the men who fought under Charles did not think of themselves as Europeans. They were Franks, they were Austrasians, they were Aquitanians and Burgundians, and a dozen other tribal and regional identities that had been fighting each other for generations. Odo and Charles had been bitter rivals who nearly went to war against each other before the Muslim invasion forced them into alliance. The idea that they shared some common identity, some unity that transcended their local allegiances, did not exist in any meaningful way. After Tours it did. In the moment of greatest threat, when an army that had conquered half the known world stood ready to sweep away everything they had built, these fragmented peoples discovered that they had something in common worth defending together. The chronicler reaching for a word to describe them could not use Frank, because Odo was not a Frank, could not use any single tribal name, because men of many tribes had stood on that ridge. So he invented a new word, or perhaps recovered an old geographical term, and gave it new meaning. Europeans. The men who had held the line were Europeans. Tours did not just save Europe from conquest. It may have invented the very idea of Europe as a unified civilization. A people who had not known they were one people discovered their unity in the desperate necessity of shared survival. Charles did not earn the name Martel during his lifetime. The hammer was bestowed upon him by 9th century chroniclers, looking back at his legacy and searching for a word that captured his essence. They found the perfect one. A hammer crushes. A hammer shapes. A hammer drives things together that do not wish to be joined. Charles did all of these things. He crushed the Neustrians and the Frisians and anyone else who stood against his rise to power. He shaped the Frankish kingdoms into something that could stand against the greatest military force of the age. He drove together rivals like Odo, who would never have cooperated without the threat of annihilation to focus their minds. He was born a bastard, the illegitimate son of a concubine, excluded from inheritance, and imprisoned by his father's legitimate wife. He escaped through means that no chronicler bothered to record and fought his way to power through 15 years of constant warfare, suffering only a single defeat in a career of relentless victory. At Tours, he was 44 or 46 years old, a grey-haired veteran who had seen more battles than most men see winters, and he stood in the centre of his formation while cavalry charges broke against his men like waves against a cliff. He died in 741, 9 years after Tours, having transformed the Franks from a collection of squabbling tribes into the dominant power of Western Europe. He never wore a crown. He ruled as mayor of the palace, while puppet Merovingian kings sat on thrones and did nothing. But his son Pepin would take the crown openly and become the first Carolingian king. And his grandson, a boy named Charles who would earn his own epithet, would be crowned emperor of the Romans by the Pope himself on Christmas Day in the year 800, and history would call him Charlemagne, Charles the Great, and the empire he built would trace its legitimacy directly back to that wall of ice between Tours and Poitiers. From a prison cell in Cologne to the grandfather of emperors, the bastard became a legend, the legend became a dynasty, and the dynasty reshaped the world. Both Christian and Muslim sources agree that something extraordinary happened on that October day in 732. The Arab chroniclers called the battlefield Balat ash-Shuhada, the Road of the Martyrs, and remembered it as a disaster sent by God to punish the faithful for their sins. The Christian chroniclers saw divine intervention of a different kind, the hand of providence shielding Christendom in its hour of greatest need. Both sides understood that this was not just another battle, not just another skirmish in the endless wars that defined the age. This was a hinge of history, a moment when the door could have swung either way, and the future of an entire continent hung on whether 15,000 men could hold their ground against cavalry that had never been stopped. Military logic said they should have broken. Every precedent said infantry cannot stand against determined cavalry charges. The Visigoths had broken. The Aquitanians had broken. Every army that had faced these horsemen from Arabia and North Africa and Syria had shattered like pottery thrown against stone. But the Franks did not break. They stood like a glacier in the cold regions, immobile as a wall, and when the unstoppable tide met the immovable barrier, it was the tide that shattered. Charles earned the name that history would give him. The men who died beneath Frankish spears found their road to martyrdom. The glacier held. We study battles like Tours, not because we love war, but because they remind us of something essential about human possibility. Sometimes the odds are impossible. Sometimes every calculation says you should lose. Sometimes the enemy is stronger and faster and has conquered everything in their path for 100 years. And sometimes, just sometimes, the line holds anyway. For nearly 1,300 years the church bells of Tours have rung in memory of the day when Europe discovered it existed and refused to die.